All right, we have got people coming in.
You'll give us the word when we're on, Maggie?
Indeed.
They can't hear us yet, can they?
Oh, yeah, they're coming in.
Oh, so they can hear us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. We will get started in just a few minutes here as we let everyone into the Zoom program. If you have any technical difficulties throughout the program, please put those in the chat, and myself and Maggie Creech will do our best to help troubleshoot those problems. And then, of course, throughout the program, if you have questions or comments, you can put the questions in the Q&A feature or in the chat. And we're glad you're here. Good morning, and we'll get started in just a few minutes here. All righty, everyone. Welcome to this month's edition of our member-only Curator Conversation. My name is Elizabeth Darling, and I'm the Manager of Membership and Annual Giving at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And I am joined today by one of our curators, Dr. Karen Sherry, who has been with the museum for a good long while now, as she gives a presentation on Who's in Your Locket, which I hope you all enjoyed as much as I did, the play on the famous advertisement campaign, What's in Your Wallet? And Dr. Karen Sherry, I would be remiss if I didn't say, has recently published a very impressive exhibition catalog of our recent exhibition, Determined, the 400-Year Struggle for Black Equality. And that is, of course, available online in our shop. And if you come and visit the building in person, you can get yourself a copy at our museum shop. So without further ado, Karen, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining us this morning. I want to especially thank today's audience because you're all members. And as you know, the museum is a private nonprofit. We do not get money from the state. So we very much rely on your support for these and all the other kinds of programs we do. So thank you for that and welcome. So as Elizabeth mentioned, the title of my talk, Who's in Your Locket? The Social Symbolism of Miniature Portraits. We're going to look at a genre of portraiture that has long roots in Western culture and is kind of the early version of what I think is still a very common practice of perhaps carrying around pictures of your kids, of your husband, of other loved ones, your pets, either in a piece of jewelry like a locket, or these days, maybe even more commonly, as the wallpaper or the home screen of your cell phone. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the beautiful little tow-headed girl in the locket on the left is our very own Elizabeth Darling. So Elizabeth, thank you for sharing that.
I've become world famous.
The earlier tradition of this practice of carrying around a picture of a loved one on your person, small format portrait that can fit into a locket, on your phone, can slip into a pocket. That tradition goes back centuries, and that's what we're going to talk about today. A genre of portraiture called miniature portraits, and as that name suggests, these are tiny little portraits, generally under 3 inches high. Sometimes they get as large as 4.5 inches high, but generally these are very small pictures that are set into lockets or pins or bracelets or a little case or a small frame. We're going to talk about the history of this practice and its social symbolism. And throughout the talk, we're going to be looking at examples of miniature paintings that are held in the VMHC collections. And in part, I developed this talk because I was recently surveying all the miniatures in our collection. We have over 80 of these types of objects in our holdings. So let's start with the miniature. This is a practice that began in the Renaissance in the courts of Europe, of England and the continent. And this was a practice by which the king or queen would give tiny portraits of themselves to their most loyal followers. And those followers, as you can see in these 2 large-scale portraits, one of Sir Francis Drake, the explorer, and another of a royal lady, Lady Denman, the recipients of these royal portraits would wear them very conspicuously on their person to demonstrate that they were a favorite of the king or queen. This practice was especially popular in Queen Elizabeth's court. And these 2 examples I'm showing are both sitters displaying their portraits of Queen Elizabeth. And we've actually identified, we know exactly which miniature portrait Francis Drake was wearing around his belt for his large scale oil on canvas portrait. And you can see a blown up detail of this item. It was called the Drake Jewel. It's this heavily encrusted jeweled locket that has a cameo carving on the outside. And when you open the lid, there's a portrait of Queen Elizabeth on the inside. Queen Elizabeth gave this gorgeous piece of jewelry with a portrait of herself to Francis Drake after he completed his circumnavigation of the globe. So it was kind of a sign of her gratitude for that great feat he did for the English queen. Now, from the Renaissance courts, this practice spread through the noble classes until by the mid-18th century, it was a common practice among upper middle class and middle class people to exchange portraits of loved ones with each other. And this is on the screen now. You see a sampling of 18th century British portraits. It was a practice that began in the royal courts and disseminated out to the upper classes who were emulating that noble practice. This practice also came to America, and most of the portraits we're going to be looking at today date from what's considered the golden age of miniature portrait, an age when this practice was especially popular from the around the 1780s through the 1840s. As you can see from this sampling on the screen, many different sitters appear in portraits, male, female, and the settings for these kinds of portraits also vary from object to object. And we're going to look at some of that phenomenon a little more closely. But I do want to underscore that even though a miniature portrait became a popular art form, it still was very class-based. It was cheaper to have a little tiny portrait made of yourself than having a large oil portrait. So miniature portraits were more accessible to the middle classes, but it still required a certain amount of money and disposable income. So as with large-scale portraiture, miniature portraits were primarily exchanged among the middle and upper classes. That means we don't see a lot of working class people pictured in miniature portraits or Black Americans pictured. Here I'm showing two fairly rare examples of Black sitters. These are from the collection of the New York Historical Society. It's a paired portrait of Pierre Toussaint, who was a very, very successful barber in New York, and his wife. And so kind of as a sign of his class, he commissioned this pair of portraits. Now, if you weren't middle class or above and wanted an image of yourself or a loved one, there were a few other options available to you before the advent of photography. You might be able to commission a drawing from an artist, or what was even more accessible was to have a silhouette portrait cut of you or a loved one. And there's some examples of silhouettes on the right side of your screen. These were all made at the Peel Museum in Philadelphia. That museum offered that service as one way to attract visitors. Now I want to back up a little bit and talk about the materials and techniques of miniature painting. As I mentioned, these are tiny little portraits. They usually don't measure more than an inch to 3 inches high. Initially, this practice relied on book illustration, manuscript illumination or illustration. And since manuscripts were made on vellum, which is a kind of treated leather, calfskin, the earliest portraits we see are watercolor on vellum, and there's an example of that at the far left. In the late 17th and early 18th century, enamel became a popular material for miniature portraits. So we start to see that material come into practice. But then in the around 1725, a female artist, Rosalba Carriera, who's Italian, but she traveled around to European courts, fulfilling commissions. She started painting in watercolor on ivory, and that really became the favored medium for miniature portraits. She would use watercolor, which is a very translucent material because it's just pure pigment, ground up pigments in various colors mixed into water. And so it's a very transparent material. And when painted on a very thin sheet of ivory, the luminosity of the ivory would kind of shine through the transparent washes of the watercolor. And part of the reason this became the favored medium is because that watercolor on ivory medium really endowed these tiny portraits with a sense of life, with a sense of the luminosity of human skin. And here are two examples of that, where I hope you get a sense. It comes across much better if you're looking at a real miniature, but you really get the sense of a living, breathing person with actual flesh. And it's that watercolor and ivory working together that produces those effects. And in addition to selecting that material as the favored material for miniature paintings by the mid-18th century, artists also had to refine their technique, and they would use a technique that's often called a stippling effect, where they take a tiny little brush and stroke on tiny little patches of brush strokes. And I hope you can see that in the detail at the far right, which gives a sort of stippling effect and again adds to the sort of lifelike quality of the portrait. And here's an image of James Peale, who was part of a family of artists. And he was really a specialist in miniature painting. And here's a portrait of him by his brother, shown at his little painter's box with a tiny sliver of ivory mounted onto a card and attached to the easel of his box. And he's painting, as you can see, with a little tiny brush. He's got a glass of water next to him to help him mix up his watercolor paints. And on the right side of the screen, you can see a 19th century painter's box. This is not James Peale's box, but it's very similar in kind to the type of box he was using and other miniature artists would have used. Now, there were many artists who painted both large scale oil on canvas portraits and tiny watercolor on ivory portraits, but there were also artists like James Peale who really specialized in miniature painting. And from the late 18th through the mid 19th century, there was enough demand for these kinds of tiny portraits that that demand could sustain a specialized breed of artists. Oops, sorry, I just hit the wrong button. Okay, here we go. All right, so now that you know a little bit about the history and the materials used to make these little portraits, I want to turn to the social significance of miniatures here in America during the golden age of miniature painting from the late 18th through the mid 19th century. Miniatures continued to be used as signs of political affiliation, and you can see that in the portrait on the left. This is an oil on canvas, a large-scale portrait of Daniel Park, who fought in the Battle of Blenheim, and he is wearing a portrait locket of Queen Anne. So Queen Anne gave him her portrait as a token of his loyalty and his bravery in that battle. You see a pin with George Washington. So this practice also continued in America. George Washington didn't necessarily distribute his own miniatures, but because he was such a huge popular figure in the early years of the new United States, many people had miniature portraits made of Washington that they would then wear in a fashion like this, with a little lapel pin tucked onto their pinned onto their jacket or something. And in the upper right, you see an example of a Russian diplomat carrying a miniature of Emperor Paul of Russia. So miniatures continued to function as signs of your political affiliation, but it became much more common practice for miniatures to become tokens of familial and romantic relationships. And so most of the miniatures commissioned during this period were commissioned by family members, by loved ones, to express that relationship. And you can see that practice in this large scale oil on canvas portrait of Deborah Stewart, who you see in the detail is wearing two bracelets. One is set with a portrait of her father. The other is set with a miniature portrait of her husband. We have an example of this kind of setting in the VMHC's collection. We don't know exactly which member of the Jennings family this miniature represents, but it passed down through the Jennings family. So it's one of their ancestors. And you can see the setting with a little mount at the top and bottom of the casing. See that mount with the holes in it? That would allow you to attach a string of pearls or some other bracelet form so that woman of the family would be able to wear this bracelet around her wrist. We also see people wearing miniature portraits and lockets around their neck. You can see that in the portrait at upper right, done by an artist whose name we don't know, but who's associated with these two portraits of Mrs. Beardsley wearing a portrait on a string around her neck. This is a portrait of her son. And you can also see from the style of this oil portrait and many of the portraits that we'll see throughout today's presentation that artists of all different skills and styles painted miniatures and painted also large-scale portraits. So you see the kind of folk manner, the non-academic style of this artist who painted Mrs. Beardsley. He was following the same portrait conventions that informed large-scale as well as small-scale portraiture, but doing it in his own style. And on the left of the screen, you'll see examples of miniatures set into various kinds of mounts. Particularly in the late 18th and the first couple of decades of the 19th century, miniatures were set into some kind of jewelry mount. A locket that you'd wear around a chain or a string, or a pin that you could attach to your clothing, or like I say, some kind of locket that you could tuck into a pocket. And that became an important part of the social symbolism of miniature, because the act of wearing a miniature painting on your portrait was a way of signaling that relationship, signaling who your loved one was, and that you held that person very dear because you literally held that person on your body through one of these types of objects. Around 1820, it became more fashionable for miniatures to go from an oval format to a square format, and they were set into small cases, usually leather-bound cases that would close and clasp shut. You would maybe keep those cases in a pocket or in the drawer of your desk or your secretary. It also became more popular after 1820 to have your miniatures framed in small pictures and hang them on a wall in your home, so display them publicly in that way. So you'll see various settings for miniatures, whether it's a piece of jewelry or a frame or a case. These were nevertheless items that signified that kind of personal relationship between the sitter and the owner of the miniature painting. And you get that sense of how these types of objects functioned as tokens of love, as symbols of love, from a quote by Abigail Adams, as she was writing to her husband, John Adams, during one of their long separations when Adams was away at the Continental Congress or on some other political business. And she wrote to him, "I have a request to you, which I hope you will not disappoint me of. A miniature of him I best love. Indulge me the pleasing melancholy of contemplating a likeness." So she's asking her husband to commission a miniature portrait so that she can have an image of him to keep close to her, to look at, to contemplate when he is away. And that sense of pleasing melancholy implies that she's going to be using this in his absence, gazing at a miniature of her husband, kind of like the woman in the painting depicted at right, gazing upon the image of her beloved while he's away. So the miniature portrait very much functioned mnemonically as a kind of stand-in for the absent presence of the loved one. As I say, by the late 18th century, during this golden age of miniature paintings, miniatures were primarily exchanged as symbols of love, as tokens of love. And that practice is perhaps best underscored by something you see in miniature portraits. On the left, you see a slightly scandalous image of a young woman who's painted in an empire style gown that is so sheer you can actually see her breasts through the sheerness of the fabric. Now, this is not the way a woman of in around 1800 would have herself portrayed in a large scale oil on canvas portrait that would hang in the living room or something. This was a tiny portrait meant to be private and for the eyes only of her beloved. You also see the kind of amative, the sentimental, the romantic traditions of miniature painting underscored by a fad for eye miniatures, as they were called, a tiny miniature painting that just shows the eye of your beloved. This fad was started by King George I when he had a painting done of his mistress, Mrs. Fitzherbert, by the great British miniaturist Richard Cosway, and that's the image in the center. And as so often happens with royal practices, they become fads that trickle down to other social classes. So lovers, especially illicit lovers, would exchange eye miniatures. They capitalize on the notion that the eye is the window to the soul. So if your lover is gazing upon an eye miniature of you, that's kind of a way of your lover connecting with you through the gaze. It also had the kind of scandalous association of only someone who knew you very well, knew you very intimately, would be able to recognize you from just your eye. So there was also that association with the miniature painting. But this is sort of a small subgenre of the much more common practice of having a bust-length portrait of yourself painted as a miniature portrait and set into a locket or case or something. The romantic associations of miniatures are also borne out in the fact that couples often exchange miniatures to commemorate their engagement or their marriage. So giving someone a miniature in those circumstances was a symbolic act of giving them your heart. And we see two examples of couples miniatures from the VMHC. They were probably done around the time of their marriages. At the upper left, we have Maria Carter Hall, who married Warner Lewis Wormley in 1807. And at lower right, we have Charles Bruce and the woman who became his wife, Sarah Alexander Seddons Bruce, in 1848. And so presumably these couples exchange portraits of themselves to mark either their engagement or their marriage. That was a very common practice. It was also common to have miniatures painted of your children. So in addition to your spouse or your fiance, also your children. And here's several examples of that. And one of the most spectacular miniatures we have in the VMHC collection shows that practice in multiples. Here we have a bracelet that shows members of the Jones family. Margaret Morton Jones, who was the wife of Gabriel Jones. She's set in the center of this elaborately mounted bracelet of 5 miniatures, and the 4 flanking miniatures are their children. So this was a way to kind of showcase your family and your love for them by commissioning and wearing these kinds of miniature portraits and the objects in which they were set into. Now, to emphasize these personal and sentimental traditions of miniatures, and also as part of the composite nature of a miniature painting itself. A portrait done in watercolor on ivory that was set into some kind of case, whether it was a jewelry setting or a frame or a box-like case. Miniatures by their nature are composite. They're both portraits and usually some kind of jewelry or other decorative item. But to enhance the personal symbolism of a miniature, patrons also often personalized the case, the mounts of the miniature in various ways. And you can see that often on the back side of the miniature, on which is engraved your initials and monograms, or the back of the miniature case is set with locks of your hair or your monogram or little seed pearls and filigree gold work combined with hair. And you can see that at the lower left of the image on the left. And then the images on the right are two examples of the miniature portraits on one side with their backing on the right. And you can see portrait on the front, some kind of hair work, either plaited or curled or otherwise styled to fit into the back casing of the miniature. Now, these kinds of practices, as I say, they enhance the personalized nature of miniatures. The use of hair work also taps into long-standing traditions of taking a lock of hair of a loved one. I know that my baby book that my mom made up, and that those of my sisters have little locks of our hair in them. We also have examples of soldiers sending off a lock of their hair to their fiancés or their wives when they went off to service, or vice versa. You might have examples of hair work in other types of objects that you have. So having a physical part of the person's, of your loved one's body, in this case, a lock of hair, was another way to capture not only your sentimental feelings, your love for that person, but also to capture their presence. So all of these different effects of the miniature, the beautiful luminous quality of the materials of watercolor on ivory, which really gave a flesh-like, living, breathing presence to the image, any kind of personalized touches like a piece of hair, also just the valuable materials themselves of ivory, of some kind of gold setting, or a setting that's embellished with little seed pearls or other paste stones or something. All of those factors emphasize the sentimental value of miniature portraits as tokens of love. Now, in addition to commemorating marriage or engagement, miniatures were also commissioned to commemorate the loss of a loved one. We're going to look at that facet of miniature paintings. We're going to look at them as tokens of both love and loss. So very often, upon the death of a loved one, you might commission a portrait of them and embellish it like you would other miniature portraits. And here are two examples. One from the VMHC collection, which we have a portrait of Jordan Armstead Wright, who died in 1834. And the back of the locket is set with a piece of his hair. And it's a little hard to see in the slide, but it's also inscribed with his name and his life date. So the backing of the miniature was engraved. We see these similar things in the miniature at lower right of Elizabeth Scott Cheever, who died in 1795, and her miniature is also engraved with her life dates, and the backing is embedded with some pieces of her hair. We don't always know if when somebody's life dates were engraved on a miniature if that engraving was done on a miniature that was made early, or if the miniature was commissioned at the time of death. Both practices were common. And this also takes us to another iteration of miniature painting, which is mourning miniatures. In addition to having a portrait miniature to commemorate the death of a loved one, that kind of permanent separation, Americans and their European counterparts also commissioned miniatures with mourning iconography upon the death of a loved one. And at the left side, you can see a pastel portrait, a kind of large-scale portrait, showing a young woman wearing one of these miniatures on her person. So mourning miniatures functioned in the same way that portrait miniatures did, as memorials, as evocations of a loved one, but in this case, evocations of the loss of a loved one. And the three examples of mourning miniatures on the right, they're all from the VMHC collection, and they show what became very standardized iconography for mourning miniatures, usually a person weeping over the tombstone of a loved one. You often see a weeping willow in the background, a sign, a kind of common symbol of death and of mourning. You'll see in the upper right, that miniature, the border of the pin, the casing of the pin is also enameled in black, the color of mourning. Just to demonstrate to you how common this iconography was, how well recognized it became as a sign of mourning. On the right is an image that I took a snapshot with my cell phone of just one small set of these mourning rings, miniatures set into rings that we have in our collection. We had like 3 or 4 of these sets in our collection. And on the left is an artist's sample card showing some of this stock iconography. So he could take this little sample card and show it to potential clients and say, okay, pick which background you would like. So mourning miniatures, as I say, were kind of subgenre of the larger practice of miniature paintings. And here are 2 examples from the VMHC collection that show that standard iconography of the weeping willow, of figures mourning at a tombstone. These are tiny little portraits. The one on the right, the one in the upper left, it's only about 2 inches high. So when you look at the detail of the painting on the tombstone, you get a sense of how tiny the brushwork of the artist had to be in order to inscribe that tombstone with the message, "A parent's loss we mourn." And this miniature was made as a memorial to William Burton, and those are his 2 daughters pictured mourning at his grave, wearing black dresses as a sign of their mourning and weeping over his tombstone. A lock of his hair is also set into the back of this pin. At lower right, there's a pendant, so something you'd wear on a necklace, that is similarly painted with a tiny, tiny inscription around the upper edge of both sides of the miniature. The front side shows a mother and a little angel weeping at a tomb, with the inscription reading, "The earth his dust contains, may angels guard it well. Fond parent, dry your tears, bend to your maker's will." So a kind of religious message suggesting that the lost child, a little boy, Samuel Curry, who died at about 2.5 years old, the message painted on the front of the miniature is a reminder that the son's death was God's will, and that angels are now guarding her son, a kind of comforting message for the parents of this lost child. And the back of the miniature, it's set with plated pieces of Samuel's hair, as well as an inscription giving his name and his life dates. And this practice of using hair work in miniature paintings it extended beyond the popularity of miniatures themselves. Miniatures, portraits, their popularity really started to wane in the 1840s. But hair work continued to be an important part of jewelry and an important part of mourning practice throughout the Victorian era and beyond. And these are some examples of hair jewelry, most associated with mourning. And so you can see the hair plaited into a pin at left, woven into this elaborate decorative pin. All the elements of the pin at upper right are indeed made of wound and twisted and tinily braided pieces of hair. And then in the bottom, that's a bracelet, and the band of the bracelet is woven hair. So again, this is an extension of the longstanding practice of taking a lock of a loved one's hair and keeping it close to your person as a sign of your love for them. Now, my final remarks are going to focus on kind of the death knell of miniature portraits. I mentioned the golden age, the popularity of miniature paintings in America and in Europe was from the 1780s through the 1840s. It was really the advent of photography that I don't want to say killed the miniature, because people did continue to commission miniatures, but the popularity of miniatures was really replaced by photography. And an early historian of American miniature painting, Harry Whale, put it this way. He said, "The miniature in the presence of the photograph was like a bird before a snake. It was fascinated and then it was swallowed." I think it's hard for us to imagine, when we live in an age when everybody carries a camera around in their pocket, just how revolutionary photography was when it was invented in 1839. You could suddenly have an exact replica of an individual. Many miniature painters were very skilled at creating a very realistic likeness, and the materials of the miniature portrait helped to convey the lifelike sense of breathing, living flesh. As I mentioned, the watercolor, a translucent medium on an ivory background. But nevertheless, photography as the newest technology around 1840, and a technology that could capture the actual likeness of a person, became much more popular and really signaled the waning of miniature portraiture. And here's a sampling of early photographs from the VMHC collection. You can see it upper left, a husband and wife photographs set into a locket. The wife's image is a little hard to see, but she's in the opened top of the locket. There's a daguerreotype, which was the first kind of photography. It's unfortunately in bad condition, but it's an image of a Black woman. And then two other miniature portraits, one set into miniature photograph. I have to stop calling them miniatures, sorry. Two early photographs, one set into a case, and one set into a pin. So initially, photographic portraits were housed and treated in the same way as painted miniatures, watercolor on ivory miniatures. But as I say, photography eventually replaced miniatures as the most popular form of portraiture and the most popular way to carry around the image of a loved one on your person. We see this overlap in the way that early portraits were housed. They were housed the same ways, worn in the same ways, consumed in the same ways that miniature portraits had been. An important distinction is that photography, as that technology developed over the middle decades of the 19th century, photography became a much more accessible medium because it was cheaper. And so more Americans than just the upper middle and upper classes could afford to have photographic portraits of themselves, and they could exchange photos much more readily than they would have been able to if only painted portraits were available. And as a final note, even though photography really rang the death knell of miniature paintings, there were clients who continued to commission miniature portraits and continue to do so up until the present day. The late 19th century also saw a short-lived revival of miniature painting. And here are two examples, the one on the left from the VMHC collection. There were societies of miniature painters formed in this period, and they exhibited their works publicly in art galleries and art shows. And part of the reason for the revival was an appreciation for the craft of miniature painting. And this was during the arts and crafts movement, when handmade, hand-worked artistry became valued as American society was rapidly industrializing. And it was also a way to showcase the effects that miniature artists could achieve in these tiny format paintings. So those are the end of my formal remarks. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now and invite you all to ask questions or share your comments, and you can do that in either the chat or the Q&A. And Elizabeth is kind of going to be our facilitator, our moderator.
Yes, thank you so much, Karen. I didn't realize how intricate the miniatures were. That was fascinating. Thank you. Well, yes, please remember to add your questions to the Q&A feature or to the chat. I do have a couple that came in. So Karen, for the miniatures that we have in our collection, are there a few that are currently on display? And if so, can you talk a little about those and where we can find them?
Unfortunately, we don't have any on display at the moment because of the medium watercolor. Watercolor is a very frangible medium. That means it's very light sensitive and it will disappear if it's exposed to light. We do very much have to limit exposure and exhibition time for our miniatures. So we don't currently have any on view unless something has changed very recently. Elizabeth or Maggie, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but we don't have any currently on display, but our members, our audiences can see examples online on our website. If you search around in our collection database on our website, you can see some of our examples.
Well, and Maggie is adding in the chat here. Maggie is our manager of education. She
yes.
is saying that we do have the portrait bracelet on display. So I think that's of the...
Thank you. Yes, of the Jones family. I completely forgot that elaborate bracelet with 5 miniatures, mother and 4 children of the Jones family. That is on view.
And
Thanks,
Maggie is also saying that we also have a hair brooch
yes.
on display as well, which as a personal just commentary, I think the hair jewelry is so interesting. I can only imagine it's akin to wearing like a very small hair shirt. I just think it would be so itchy. But that's my own personal thought.
It's the hair jewelry and like the use of hair work in miniatures. It's like so creepy, but also so fascinating.
Well, and just the intricacy of it. It's really astonishing what they're able to do.
It was so popular in the Victorian age. You can find artist catalogs, like there were shops that specialized in hair jewelry. So you would go to their catalog and pick out, okay, I want a bracelet woven like this. And I should say, the ideal was to have some hair of your loved one incorporated into the jewelry, but sometimes the artist had to incorporate just some extra hair in order to have enough hair to, make a bracelet or to make a plated background for your miniature locket or something. So yeah, hair jewelry is weird and wonderful.
Yes. Okay, so we do have a question here. Can you schedule to come see a specific miniature? So I think Karen.
A tentative yes. As you, our members, know, we are currently under construction, and it makes it somewhat challenging for staff, including us curators, to access our storerooms, to have rooms in which we can accommodate visitors to show them collections that are not on view. That said, we do try to be as accommodating as we can. It is just best if you contact us as far in advance as possible to give us enough time to, move stuff around in storage and find a room that's not having jackhammering done in it or something. We do keep our collections in secure limited access storage, and that limited access is even more limited due to construction. But we try to be as accommodating as possible. It just helps us to have as much advance notice.
And then to add to that, as well, as I'm sure all of our members know, as we keep telling you, but we are planning to have our grand reopening in April of 2022. So we are excited to welcome you all back and make visiting our collection a whole lot easier after that time. And I do apologize if anyone is picking up the miscellaneous thumps and jackhammers that are going through my headphones. So it's always a new day over here.
I didn't schedule that, but the museum, we are open. We have some new exhibitions, but we're also an active construction zone. So you'll hear that sometimes when you visit.
The sound of progress. All right, so we do have another question. What influenced the change from going from ivory to synthetic ivory?
Yes, in the late 19th century, as part of the miniature revival, miniaturist painters were using a kind of synthetic ivory that was porcelain based. And part of the reason for that was size. The miniature portraits from the golden age of miniature painting that were done on very thin sheafs of ivory that were sliced from the tusk of an elephant or a walrus. Those could only be so big, limited by the size of the animal and the size of its tusks. The miniature revival, miniatures were still fairly tiny, but they did get a little larger, maybe to like 4 to 5 inches. Sometimes 6 if the artist really wanted to go wild. And they were often rectangle format. They were framed like a large scale painting, hung on a gallery wall. And you don't have a lot of elephants or walrus walking around with tusks large enough from which to get a 5 or 6 inch rectangle of ivory. The ivory was also becoming more expensive, so it could be there were economic reasons as well for the transition from ivory to synthetic ivory. So it was a combination of practical or an artist's intentions and also economic factors that influence that shift. One thing I would like to do as a future research project is figure out what the ivory supply was like, how artists went about getting their, or how the supply chain worked. I mean, artists could buy their sheets of ivory from artist supply stores. That's where they would get their pigments, their brushes, and so forth. Artist supply stores were established in America earlier in the 18th century, or they would order from England or Europe. But I don't know exactly who was supplying the ivory and how that worked. I would love to learn more about that.
Well, and that we've still got implications about that today with the ivory trade. So yeah, I think that would be a long and storied history for sure. Well, we do have time for just 1 or 2 more questions. So if you have a burning question, please add that to the Q&A or the chat. I do have a question that I have always wondered, and it's about hair jewelry. So Karen, if you know, when did we stop making this creepy but fascinating jewelry? Because I don't know anyone these days who wears hair jewelry.
No, and that's a practice that really kind of waned at the end of the Victorian era. So in the late 19th century, The Victorians, they had very, very elaborate mourning mourning rituals, and hair jewelry was part of that. So, those elaborate bracelets and pins woven out of hair, those really went out of fashion by the late 19th century. However, as I said in my talk, the practice of keeping a lock of your loved one's hair, that long predated the fashionability of hair jewelry. It also long survived it. So, I think for as weird as hair jewelry is, it speaks to a very, very pervasive desire, human desire to have something physical of your loved one, whether it's a lock of hair, or these days it's more common to have a digital photograph or something on your cell phone, but there's still that tradition.
Yeah, there is
and
something about it that it's so odd, but yes, you're right, it's so fascinating and you're right, visceral. And we do have Maggie has commented that she would wear hair jewelry, so I misspoke. I do know some people that would wear hair jewelry. All right, well, we have reached the end of our time together, so thank you so much, members, for joining us today. Just a couple of upcoming programs to plug in our program. We have upcoming in-person banner lectures in our Robbins Family Forum. Members have the exclusive benefit of viewing the programs in person. We request that you register beforehand, but if you come on the day, that is totally fine as well. The next lectures will be on August 19th and September 2nd. We also have our upcoming virtual Between the Lines book club that will meet next on August 28th. The book is Big Stone Gap by Adriana Trigiani. And we have, for more in-person events, we've got Member Mondays at Virginia House that will return in September. And then finally, our next Curator conversation will be in October, on October 18th, and we will be discussing our newest exhibition, Violins of Hope. If you have more questions or comments about miniature portraits, hair jewelry, whatever in the collection, Karen can always be reached by email at ksherry@virginiahistory.org. And of course, you can always reach out to me, Elizabeth Darling, edarling@virginiahistory.org. And as Karen mentioned before, we do have a lot of our collection is digitized on our website as well. So Karen, thank you so much for leading us through the interesting history of miniature portraits today. And much thanks to Maggie as our tech guru for today. So everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. And we look forward to seeing you either virtually or at the museum soon. Take care.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Bye.